Hey guys, welcome back. So now getting into 2019, Morbius, the Living Vampire, which really feels like Vita Ayala is setting up some things not only for the character of Morbius, but also for some newer and throwback characters that we may see cross into other titles later on. So let's get into it. But first, if you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe to catch the spills every week, and don't forget to hit that bell up top so we can squat up in the comments for the first hour. Alright, so jumping in, we start off with the Melter, who's set up shop in this warehouse in Greenpoint, Brooklyn. And really it surprised me to see the Melter here, because for the most part, he's like your old, long forgotten Iron Man villain, whose origin is a lot like it should have been in Spider-Man Far From Home. And really you could say that with either of his origins, because originally he was a weapons developer who failed an inspection, and later his company was bought out by Tony Stark. But also around 2016 he was given a slightly different origin, to where in this case, much like Justin Hammer, he attempted to build another Iron Man suit, but specifically when he tried to reinvent the arc reactor, he literally ended up melting those suits. But either way, Bruno Horgan, he's been a character who's been haunted by failure, because with whichever origin you may go with, he's either been taken down by Iron Man or the Fantastic Four, but in most cases Iron Man. But even with doing so, with every attempt, he never really made it that far. And so at this point where we see him again 4 years later in Morbius, he's come to the point where he's decided to switch it up. And rather than developing technology to give someone power, he switched over to testing formulas that would give people powers without needing a suit. And like to try it out, he's testing it on his henchmen, who are super nervous because they know this guy ain't no chemist. And he probably learned everything he know about chemistry through YouTube, and like watched the first 2 minutes of a video, stopped the video and was like, nah, I got this. And from there just started testing his results on his henchmen. But before he gets to try his latest formula on this dude who was probably gonna die as soon as he got it, because at the end of the day, he's not doctor or anything, he's Bruno Horgan. That's it. And I mean, he has a master's, but it has nothing to do with biology or chemistry. So on the strength of that alone, I'd have been the henchman who would have been like, nope, I'll pass. But before he injects this dude with a lethal dose of liquid failure, a few of his other guys come running in telling him that they've seen a monster. And initially he's thinking like, what is this, a raid? But after that he's like, well, it can't be a raid because you don't see no cops. But as it turns out, bodies start dropping with something lurking in the shadows, who of course is Michael Morbius, who at this point goes through like all of his men like classic horror film style, just going through every last one of them, at least the ones that didn't run away. But with doing this, Morbius had known for some time that the Melter, he had pretty much came to this warehouse in Brooklyn, taking it over using whatever fear tactics, and made this his own base of operations, which is kind of the basis that Morbius uses to justify him going through here and tearing these dudes apart, because of what the Melter and his goons have caused the people of Brooklyn to suffer, which could also likely make it a more personal thing, because for a while in your 2013 Morbius the Living Vampire Volume 2, Morbius stayed in Brownsville, Brooklyn, which is about 5.5 miles from Greenpoint. But while there, he had grown an attachment to a few people, started a gang war, but for the most part while there, he was protecting the people of Brownsville, which is likely something he's using to justify slaughtering these villains in Brooklyn, which is something that Morbius does quite often, because with him not being able to quench his thirst for blood, over the years, one way or another, he'll find a way just to justify who he ends up feeding on, and if he can't justify it, then he's just like, well, that's just who I am. But all in all, the thing that keeps him going is the hope that he'll eventually find a cure, which is what we find out is the true reason why Morbius made his move on the Melter to take from him the supplies which the Melter had already stolen. So once again, it's like him just justifying the means of what he's doing, because even still, he's dealing with this insatiable need to feed. But even in the case of him attacking the Melter and taking what he needed from his supplies, in spite of how it looked, he actually left a number of survivors, including the Melter himself. But with trying to find this cure for Morbius, it's a bit deeper than just the hope of being cured, because along with that, there's the people he's lost along the way. Like Emil, for example, who's been his friend since childhood, who worked alongside Morbius for many years, helping him trying to find a cure to his blood disease, to whom Morbius also killed once he became a living vampire. So for Morbius, it's more than just trying to find a solution, but there's also this element of trying to make sure that Emil didn't die for no reason. But so when we see Morbius get back to this abandoned home, which he's turned into a laboratory, when he tries out this new mixture, which gives him the nearly immediate result of being human without the urge to drink blood, but the ears and the nose is still gonna need some work. Like I could just imagine, like if you cut off all the sound, you can hear the wind blowing through them nostrils. But back over at the warehouse with the Melter and the few of his henchmen who are still alive, who either didn't run away or have their spine eaten like a Twizzler. But when we jump back over here, they have yet another security breach, who as it turns out is a woman by the name of Elizabeth Van Helsing. And when she shows up, she more or less just tells the Melter, like, dude, calm down, we're here for the same thing, and that she also wants Michael Morbius dead. And for those of you who aren't familiar with her character, there's a good reason for that, because this is her first appearance, but her history is something that gets revealed as the story progresses, and doing so really in a way to set her up to appear in other series outside of Morbius Volume 3. But in the case of Morbius, whose recently found cure has quickly worn off, he suddenly transforms back into a living vampire, but in this case, he finds himself actually worse off than he was before. And when he transforms back, it's much more beastly than the Morbius that we're used to. And in this case, his thirst is way crazier, he can barely think straight, and at this point, the only thought he can really scrape together is feeding. And like when he finally does get to feed just a little bit, he realizes the mistake that he made. With the samples he had taken from the Melter, they weren't of the best quality, and when he had put together this new cure, he didn't try it with like a sample of his blood to at least see what the result would be, and he had just taken it because he was certain that it would work. But as it turns out, because his mutation was so far along, this cure, it didn't know how to differentiate between which part of him was human and which part of him wasn't. And of course, when he had taken it, it eventually started killing the wrong gene, which in turn backfired, causing him to turn into a more primitive bat-like creature. And theoretically, had he taken this cure like years earlier, there's a high probability that it could have been a permanent solution. But with him just rushing and trying this method now, without testing his cells, which are different now, it of course gave him a completely different result. But before he can even run a test to figure out what he needs to change, he's immediately met with the arrival of Elizabeth Van Helsing and the Melter, who found him here because Elizabeth tracked him back all the way from the Melter's warehouse. But it's also here where we learn a bit more about her history as she takes out her frustrations on Morbius, declaring her revenge and revealing that she is the sister of Emil, Morbius's childhood friend, who he had known for years, who had also helped him in the search for a cure, only to be killed after Morbius's initial transformation. So it's like on her end, the motive is clear. Emil was her brother, he dedicated his life to helping Michael Morbius, only to become food in the end. But because of her anger, what she doesn't see is the guilt and regret that Morbius has to live with after killing one of his closest friends. And like in the case of Morbius, it appears like when he doesn't feed, the acceleration in his new mutation, it speeds up. And as soon as that kicks in, Elizabeth goes for the grenade, and she doesn't even give the Melter a warning. She just goes for the grenade, pulls the pin, and blows the place up. Which of course doesn't kill Morbius, but rather gives him an opportunity to escape. Which of course gets him out of that immediate situation, but it also causes him to kind of pause and think, like, how long has Elizabeth been hunting him? And like, how long has she been preparing and studying him with the objective of taking him down for good? Because after this, when he makes his way to a lab and he feeds on the guards, mainly out of desperation and really just trying to take as much as he needed. But it's also here that we find out with the weapons that Elizabeth is using, Morbius's wounds aren't healing. And with doing this, it's like she's figured out things about Morbius that we really haven't even known to this point, which is something we'll likely get more information on down the road as far as specific weaknesses to Morbius and living vampires. But with Morbius, like while he's here tending to his wounds, the guards who he had only taken enough blood from just to make sure he fed so he can get his head straight and tend to his wounds, the guards, they end up setting off the alarm, which instantly spiked Morbius's adrenaline. And with that, it's like the blood is just metabolized quicker and he's hungry again. And I'm talking about big hungry, which causes him to go right back after the guards, to where this time he likely wants to feed till they ain't got no blood no more. But when he finally makes his way back and finds the guards who set off the alarm, he doesn't quite get his fix, because just before he rips one of the dudes in half, like just in the nick of time, Spider-Man shows up. And he really has no idea about the new Morbius that he's dealing with right now, mainly because of these dramatic changes happening so recent. But he'll figure it out pretty quick. Alright, so in our last talk, when we had seen Michael Morbius attempt to make another cure for himself with ingredients which he had stole from the Melter, to whom we had talked about prior to this point, like with the Melter, he's not known for using quality products. But with Morbius making this most recent attempt at creating a cure, this instead enhanced the bat-like features of his DNA, because this new cure, quote unquote, couldn't tell the difference of what part of him was bat and what part was human. To where I just imagine the cure getting in his bloodstream, flipping a coin, and then shortly after realizing that it completely lost that gamble. But to make things worse, with him not long after being met with the arrival of Elizabeth Van Helsing, who's a character that we're newly introduced to within this series, and it's made pretty clear quite quickly that she's here for revenge, which as it turned out was from Morbius killing her brother Emil many years ago. And so where we pick up at this point is after she had followed Morbius back and attempted to blow him up with a grenade, which instead allowed him to get away. But it's here where Elizabeth and the Melter are here after, where the Melter starts asking Elizabeth questions, because as you'd imagine, he's pretty curious about this vampire doing science experiments at an undisclosed location. But as it turns out, when Elizabeth tells the Melter that Morbius isn't your conventional vampire, but rather he's become what he is through the means of science, the Melter then sees that as an immediate means for making money. And if you think about it, like with the change in his focus, which has recently gone from making gadgets to like now making back alley super soldiers with like mostly drugstore ingredients, when he learns about Morbius, it really intrigues him, and it shifts his focus to wanting to take what Morbius has and more or less figure out how to modify or weaponize it. And this immediately causes him and Elizabeth to part ways, because one, her main focus right now is on destroying Morbius, and the last thing she wants is another Morbius running around. So it's like just before they part ways, she also lets the Melter know that the next time that they meet, it'll more likely be as an enemy than an ally. But jumping over to Morbius, who at this point is recently broken into a chemical lab, he's met by the arrival of Spider-Man, who had heard the alarm which was set off by the guards. And he really gets there just in time because Morbius, he clearly was about to eat this guy. But even with this, like, keep in mind, Peter, he doesn't know like the recent events that have occurred with Morbius, and all he really knows when he arrives here is like, hey, this ain't a good look. And for Peter, his most recent knowledge of Morbius is much of what we talked about in the previous video about Morbius's time in Brownsville, to where at that time he had really stepped into the role of a hero for that community. And this entire situation is very far from that. But another thing that happens here with Morbius is like when his adrenaline spikes, which is exactly what happened here in the lab when the alarm went off, but when his adrenaline spikes, it then acts as a catalyst, causing him to become more primal. And in a way, it kind of helped because it did give the guard the opportunity to run away. But even still, you got Peter with this new Morbius situation that he's trying to figure out. And the thing that Peter doesn't get initially with trying to ask Morbius what's going on with him, so he'll kind of know what to do to help him out, because essentially he just wants to help his friend. But with Morbius being so far gone at this point, he needs to feed, and it's like he can't even put the words together to tell him anything but that. And like throughout this scuffle, when there's a brief moment where Peter thinks Morbius has calmed down, but instead he just jumps up, turns around, and bites him on the neck, which instantly subsides his condition for the time being. But even still, being bit by Morbius, like, it initially like spooks Peter, and for good reason, because when this happens, the first thing that Peter wants to know is like, hey, am I about to change? And when Morbius catches him up on everything that's been going on, he then lets Peter know that now his bite won't change him. But on the flip side, he does believe that Peter's blood could be part of the solution to either fixing this new condition or at the least getting him back to how he was, which is essentially back to living vampire instead of the current living bat situation. But even with this, Peter agrees to help him out, but only under two conditions. One, that he stops biting people, and two, that he answers to what he's done with all these recent attacks. And in response, Morbius just pretty much tells him that he'll do his best, which to be honest, lately hasn't been that good. But from here, in order to find like a private place to work, they then make their way to the summer house of Dr. Kurt Connors, who's also known as the Lizard. And in a way, just coming here, it kind of brings things around, and it really makes you think about what Morbius has done both for Peter Parker and for Kurt Connors in the past. And even like that weird science connection between the three of them, which even to this day, I don't think it's really had like this thorough explanation, and it's really just been chalked up to the way that they've been written. But with Morbius's bite, at one time turning the Lizard back into Kurt Connors, and then on top of that, his blood helping Spider-Man get rid of the extra 4 arms. And it's like, I feel like with that circle of circumstances, that there's always been like this underlining gene-specific connection between the three of them. And with that, you can kind of understand at this point with Morbius, like he needs to benefit from this somehow, some way, with his condition now being worse than it's ever been. And really at this point, he just needs it now more than ever. But while they're here setting up and getting samples of Morbius's blood in order to test, he takes the time to catch Peter up with what's happened since Brownsville, to where essentially after that story wrapped, he left town, started traveling, and just attempted to lay low, and mostly out of guilt for the destruction which he feels like really began from him being there in the first place. But even this time away brought him back to searching for a solution for his cure, which clearly fast forward to now ain't been going too well. But it's also here where he tells Peter more of the details of his condition, to where upon attempting his cure, the solution which he had put into his bloodstream, that he had hoped to get rid of the bat part of his DNA, but at the time with him being a living vampire for so many years, this cure didn't know which part of him to get rid of. So essentially it's like it's killing the human part of him instead of the bat part. And if you think about it, it really makes sense, because like any living organism that feeds and continues to live, and at some point in time may have to rebuild itself, whether it's for injury or whatever the cause may be, that living organism's body, it'll need to build more cells. And for Morbius, for like the longer that he's been a living vampire and needing to feed and needing to recover from injuries, and I'd imagine even perhaps something as simple as even cutting his hair. But over time, with his body needing to reproduce more cells, but over the years, these cells have been becoming less and less human in comparison to the beginning of his transition. And because of that, his cure just didn't know what to do. But with Peter agreeing to do this and definitely being hesitant about just handing over his blood, but even with agreeing to do so, like when Morbius asks him if he has any idea what it's like to go around like a monster, and though Peter doesn't say it out loud, we know that he's been through a number of situations where he's either transformed into a literal spider or just dealt with the extra arms. And it's really just the thought of this that causes him to go through and allow Morbius to begin a couple trials with Peter's blood. But with Morbius testing this out, it works initially, but not long after, it just reverts right back. And like with them working on this, from the time they arrived up until now, I'd imagine it was like a few hours or so. But when it comes to the point to where Peter's like, okay, we got some progress, let's pick this up later, but Morbius is like, no, I will literally not rest until I find this cure, which is one of those things that just had me like, okay, well, can just go on by your track record, we just never gonna sleep again, huh? Because clearly you've been trying this for years and there's either just not a solution, or perhaps even if he stepped away and took a break, a newer idea would come to him. And although none of this is anything that Morbius wants to hear, but even still, Peter kind of puts towards him the concept of just accepting who he is, and instead using his time and resources and spending them on finding a way to adapt and really just reconsider living his life differently. And really just on top of all that, just stressing about it is going to make the condition worsen and occur more frequently. But in the middle of this dispute, a flash grenade comes flying through the window, because at this point, Elizabeth Van Helsing has found Morbius again. Because if it hasn't been made clear, like she ain't going nowhere until either her or Morbius is taken down for good. Alright, so jumping back in from where we had seen Peter run into this new version of Morbius who had stolen some shady supplies from the melter in order to concoct a new version of a cure for his pseudo-vampirism, which instead more so had the result of curing the pseudo-vampire by killing its human cells, making Michael Morbius's condition way more primal and uncontrollable. But like we had seen when he had ran into Peter, who told him he would help him out, they had then made their way to the Lizard's summer home in order to borrow his lab, but while they were there working on a cure, they were then attacked by Elizabeth Van Helsing, the sister of Emil, who Morbius had previously killed just after his initial transformation. And when she shows up here, we get a bit more backstory about the relationship between her, her brother, and Morbius growing up, because for Elizabeth, she believes that the monster that Morbius had become, like that monster had killed her brother and Michael Morbius, and she believes for that reason the monster has to die. But within this flashback that just runs through her mind before she delivers the killing blow, we look back at a bit of the history between the three of them, which really doesn't veer that far from the traditional history, because prior to this we had always had the story to where Michael and Emil had grown up together, to where eventually they both went to university. But in this case, with us only really getting the addition of Emil having a sister, who by the way was a fan of the Karate Kid, which is a wink to Ralph Macchio, the writer of Morbius Bond of Blood, who happens to have the same name of the Karate Kid. But aside from this and our confirmation of Michael Morbius being a Star Wars fan, but in a fun way, all this just paints a picture of how close all of them were from a young age, to where eventually at one point Elizabeth had expressed her feelings to Michael, only for him to then tell her at the time that he just wanted to be friends. But once again, for Elizabeth, she looks back on all of this like as fond memories, and at the time she had very much cared for Michael. But as far as here and now, all she sees is a monster, who again is the monster that killed Michael and killed Emil. And in the case of Michael Morbius, like, it doesn't help that he's in the worst condition of his life right now, with this most recent attempt making him more bat than human. But at this point, you also have the case to where Peter, he tries to step in and de-escalate the situation. And he tries to get Elizabeth to simmer down for a moment so he can explain what's going on, but Elizabeth is not trying to hear that, because all she sees is a monster rather than seeing Morbius still inside there trying to find a cure. And to her, the death of this monster is the only solution to getting justice for Emil and Michael. But with Peter trying to calm her down, she has the nerve to more or less tell him, if you were a hero, you would be helping me. And right away, Peter's like, okay, first of all, you introduced yourself with a grenade. So right away with that, it's like, okay, yeah, like she needs help. But first things first here, like let's be clear, you're not here for justice, you're here for revenge. And Elizabeth doesn't even try to correct Spider-Man by any means, because from her perspective, like the actions that need to be taken in order to achieve either revenge or justice, to her they're the same either way, because it just comes down to killing the monster. And for that reason, she really just doesn't care what anybody wants to call it. But again, in the case of Michael Morbius, with him being in an enhanced state of his pseudo-vampirism, which not only has made him physically bigger, but he's substantially stronger, but also here with a thirst for blood that's even crazier than what he was struggling with before. But with her attacking him continuously and him not fighting back, he lets her know like, hey, stop playing, this hunger will force me to end you. Which in my opinion is a very sincere statement on the behalf of Michael Morbius, because really he can turn this matchup into a brutality real quick, like let's be honest. Like if he wasn't dealing with the guilt, if this wasn't Emil's sister, if Michael Morbius just didn't care, then he would have been ended this. Like let's just call a spade a spade. But also in this moment with Peter seeing the frustration of Morbius, he then tries to step in, which only gets him backhanded. But in this moment with both Peter and Elizabeth getting knocked away, Peter tries to explain to Elizabeth like we need to get this guy help, because out of guilt he took even riskier measures to try and cure his condition, but instead this new solution, it's curing the monster of what is human, which is Michael Morbius inside of there fighting against this cure, just trying to hold on. And for a brief moment Elizabeth, she kinda sees that, but when we go deeper into her story, like from the time of her brother's death, it's here we get a look at the process that has just caused her to be so far gone. Because for Elizabeth, she remembers her brother Emil as this person who was always deeply pained by the suffering of others, which is why with time him and Michael got so close, and Emil had practically dedicated his life to helping his best friend Michael find a cure. And though initially she looked at the incident as an act of desperation on the behalf of Michael in order to cure his blood condition, but over time she didn't see it as desperation, but instead she later believed that it was Michael's pride that eventually cost both him and her brother their lives. And for Elizabeth, after burying her brother, on that day a part of her died too. So after that, she joined the military so that she could train and become stronger in order to hunt this monster down, to where after that, she then studied everything she could about vampires, werewolves, and the Necronomicon. And in the case of the Necronomicon, in Marvel Comics, that's the Book of the Dead. And long story short, it's an ancient spin-off based on a portion of the Darkhold, and it goes all the way back to the second host and the sinking of Atlantis. But one of the things that it doesn't mention here, but I think that it was probably referring to, is that the Necronomicon itself, it also breaks down different types of ancient vampires, which for Elizabeth is something that she also had went on to study. But from what we see here, she didn't have that exact book like the actual Necronomicon, and really and truly that doesn't matter because Michael Morbius is not an actual vampire. But nonetheless, she studied monsters thoroughly in order to prepare herself to meet him again one day. And with seeing this, I think the craziest thing about it is like with some of the stuff she found from her studies when she fought Morbius before, like some of these things actually worked. And even though it wasn't like your traditional garlic or crosses or things of that nature, but within her studies she eventually found something that worked on Morbius, which originated from the Darkhold, which I thought was pretty crazy. But through the years for Elizabeth, with her preparing to meet this monster, she eventually found some vampire hunters, and it was from there where she sharpened her skills and more so learned to become a hunter. But during this time, during her vampire hunting phase, she really had just saw all this experience as practice, so that when she eventually met Morbius, she wouldn't just freeze up in fear, or that she wouldn't just choke given the opportunity to kill him. But also with seeing this, I'd say that it was probably around this time where she had came up with the pseudonym Elizabeth Van Helsing, which is what she initially appeared as towards the beginning of the series before we got the reveal that she was the sister of Emil, which all in all was really just her trying to throw off the suspicion of anyone knowing who she truly was. But at the same time, it's the classic comic book trope to where someone kind of changes their name, but really not really. But with Elizabeth being able to create some space, it eventually comes to the point to where Morbius, he gives her the opportunity to go for the kill, because if that's truly the solution, that's something that we've seen before that Michael could never do himself, which is something we've also got a glimpse of within Ralph Macchio's Morbius Bond of Blood. Because within that one shot, we had taken another look into the tragic event of the transformation of Michael Morbius. And with doing so, not only does it revisit him killing Emil shortly after, but also that moment to where after he had taken the life of his best friend, he had then realized the creature that he had become, and he had then attempted to take his own life by trying to drown himself after. But even then he couldn't do it because there was a part of him that just demanded that he continue to live, which is what then caused him to swim to the surface, to where he was then picked up by a ship that was just passing by, and I think we all know how that went. But then it's here for Elizabeth where she just takes Morbius at his word. And with doing so, just thinking about how this monster had killed not just her brother, but also Michael, who's the man at one point that she loved. But with Elizabeth taking the shot and calling it a day, she just walks away, but Morbius heals back up in seconds after not dying from a shot to the heart because he's not a vampire, but also at this point because of his mutation going to the next level and all this action then accelerating that mutation, and it causes him to kind of lose it here for a minute. And though even still he tries to catch himself from even slipping into a version of himself that wants to kill Elizabeth, but before he can, Peter jumps back in and he lets Morbius bite him on the forearm, which in this case calms Morbius down way more effectively than it would have been with just anyone's blood, and mainly because there's always been this thing between the enhanced DNA between Spider-Man, Morbius, and the Lizard. And with doing this, it gives Peter an idea on how to combat the Melter and create a cure for the creatures that he's created by recently using his henchmen as guinea pigs, because theoretically in their case this is something that'll work with their transformations being new, which gives them the higher probability of their mutations being reversible. And unlike Morbius, who with time his chances of just gotten slimmer and slimmer. But when we jump back over to Greenpoint, and it's here where we see the Melter doing more of these transformations to his men, and it's also here where we find out that the Melter has an aggressive case of leukemia, which is also why he switched from making suits to constructing a serum, which had recently then changed again when he had taken inspiration from Michael Morbius. But with the Melter starting with the serum approach rather than the shock therapy, he had then supplemented the serum to where instead of using bats like with Morbius' method, the Melter had instead just used any kind of creature he could find just running around New York. But before he can inject the last goon with like the latest version of his serum, the Melter is then met by the arrival of Spider-Man, Elizabeth, and Morbius. And I know that last goon was just like, whew, I'm so glad to see these guys. But as soon as they showed up, the Melter then panicked and he injected himself with the last doses of his serum, which as he would say, he added a bit of a kick to, so he could see how it would respond to his final subject. But after using it on himself, it had just broke out into this boss battle with Spider-Man, Elizabeth, and Morbius, fighting all kind of mutated pigeons, roaches, rats, dogs, hedgehogs, and I don't know about the hedgehogs, but it got ridiculous. But with them coming here and having like Peter's original plan of using the regular blood of Elizabeth in order to make a cure to reverse the serum of the Melter and his men, but when they tried the cure that they had brought, it didn't work because this new serum that the Melter had made, it had been modified from what they had seen before. And because of that, Morbius, he then whips up like an updated version, which he barely gets to put together because these guys are still attacking him, which then pisses him off again because he wishes he had the opportunity that these guys have to where their condition is still reversible. But when Morbius finding this solution, they then start to use it on a bunch of these guys, and they catch most of them, though a few of them do still get away. But with wrapping this up, they cure the Melter, and they make sure he sticks around so that the authorities can handle him and the other goons that have been cured. But with things settling down, Elizabeth, she disappears, and Morbius, he takes the last bit of the cure, which calms his mutation, but it doesn't turn him all the way back into like the regular Morbius that we're used to, because it brings him back to his regular size, but he still has wings. Because even though this cure neutralizes the components that he had got from the Melter in the first place, it still doesn't compensate for what's now the new baseline form of his mutation. But also with Morbius knowing how to make a cure for this serum that the Melter had made, he then takes it upon himself to reproduce the cure so he can then cure the other goons who had got away. But when we jump over to Brownsville, Brooklyn the next night, as he's producing more of the cure, and just before he heads out to track the last few of these creatures down, he's then paid a visit by Elizabeth. And when she stops by, it's real quick, like she really just comes by to tell him that she's wrong about what she thought about him, with her initially believing that he was only about his pride, but now she understands that he cares for the well-being of others. But after telling him this, she then leaves, because from here she has to pretty much figure out like what she's gonna do with her life, since now it's not solely dedicated to the destruction of Michael Morbius. But with how this ends, we're kind of left with this conclusion of Morbius going out and curing the last of the Melter's henchmen, and from there just going back to trying to find a cure for himself again. And with how it's done, it's kind of moments in this series to where it seems like he was going to go forward and try different methods outside of medicine, but with a lot of things shutting down in 2020, a lot of comic series got canceled, and 2019 Morbius was just one of those on the chopping block. And it's kind of a shame because one of the things that I was looking forward to was a good modern rematch between Morbius and Blade, but instead, because of what we got with Morbius Bond of Blood earlier this year, it almost feels like Marvel's saying that 2019 Morbius just didn't happen. But hopefully, fingers crossed, that's not the case, and by some means a miracle happens and we still get this. But until then, the movie's gonna be fire, so at least we got that. And so now real quick, I want to give a special shout out to all the patrons. Thank you guys for all your support, and for anyone who's new here who wants more information on how to support the channel, I got a link below so we can go to patreon.com/dopespill. But that'll do it for this one, guys. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below, and we'll do it again on the next one. Alright, later.